Talk human to me.
Talk human to me.
Talk human
Talk
to me.
human to me.
Talk human to me. Talk human to me.
Welcome to the Talk Human to Me podcast,
where entrepreneurs open up to questions beyond their ideas and ventures.
Who are they really?
And why do they do what they do?
But a second part of that thought is also how we can be so amazingly smart and creative and yet also sometimes so amazingly dumb.
What's up, beautiful humans? It's Jess Shao, your Talk Human to Me host. So, we find that doers, creators, and makers often look for podcasts that offer up insights into entrepreneurship. Although each of our guests are incredible entrepreneurs, we talk with them about everything but entrepreneurship. This podcast wants to remind you about all the other parts that make you a complete human being, like our emotions, hobbies, mental health, philosophy, and where we grew up. And most entrepreneurs and colleagues know Tom Rendell as the founder of Swipe magazine in London and now working out of Pop-Up magazine in San Francisco. However, all of that went out the window. We just wanted to talk with Tom the human. And Tom the human thinks about things like the incredible spectrum of creativity and imagination across humans, and how ultimately we just need to be good to others and try not to be bad to ourselves. So if you are an entrepreneur, doer, maker, or creator looking to balance out your podcast playlist, listen in as Tom sits down to talk human to me. All right, let's get started here. I've got Tom in the house. We're actually at my apartment right now. I think for some of the listeners that are part of the same crew that we hang out in, the Sandboxers, this is Tom Rendell. So for all you Tom Rendell fans out there that are waiting in line to see this man, I got tickets to the show today, so so I'm glad we're able to hang out, and thank you for coming out to the apartment on a Saturday morning.
Thanks for having me, it's so cool.
Yeah. Okay, so Tom, as you've heard all the episodes, we start with the exact same question, and it's okay. Everyone always says they thought of it, but they might have thought of something. They might just blank at the moment. It's all right, but I'm gonna ask it.
Sure.
And that is, what about humans strikes you the most?
It is a very good question. I think I reflect on it very briefly, and I think it is our capacity to think and be so amazingly intelligent and so amazingly creative and create so many things that are both real in terms of physical structures and technologies and clothing and infrastructure and all those insane things that you see around, and also create things that are real but we can't see, whether it's mythology or religion or layers of culture and understanding, consensual understanding, like the little webs that tie billions of people together all over the world, whether one person's in Japan, one person's in London, one person's in Canada, they're all connected by one belief system or opinion, whether they know it or not. The interconnectedness of those things that we create that I guess supposedly other species or other things in the world don't create, or that we don't know that they create, is insane and blows my mind. But a second part of that thought is also how we can be so amazingly smart and creative and yet also sometimes so amazingly dumb and act almost and totally against all these great things that we've come to know and discover. So the sort of great interesting spectrum of our amazing intelligence and sometimes our amazing stupidity as well, and that's all going on in the same, I guess, biologically 99.9% similar brains is just completely amazing.
So you got on one spectrum intelligence, on the other side of the spectrum just complete like non-intelligence, not thinking, acting in foolish ways, right?
Yeah.
So then you also mentioned creativity. What to you of creation and creativity, what's on the other side of that spectrum?
The opposite from creativity?
Yeah.
I guess you could call it a lack of imagination, a desire to just accept the world exactly as it is. But I think it's important to say that I would never blame anyone for taking these positions, for taking a position of not wanting to discover more or wanting to live inside their own, growing up in the same neighborhood they've always lived in, because I think it's just you're often a product of the environment in which that happens. It just amazes me that you can get one person who will never leave their neighborhood, will never think about outside of the belief system or thoughts maybe their parent had, and another person will maybe move across 20 different countries and be a worldwide star and totally develop their worldview so incredibly broadly. Those two people are the same. Look what happens to one and look what happens to another. It's that huge potential in every person. And from what I can tell, there seems to be no limit on the potential of people. It's very much the limiting circumstances that they're in, or the very beneficial circumstances that they're in, can create these amazing outcomes. So I guess I kind of feel like with the right environment, inspirations, tools, anyone can go on to just about do anything, really. Whether it's developing musical skills or becoming incredibly smart, or for the most part becoming fantastic at certain sports. I think that potential is within everyone, and that's, I guess, down to just how amazing our brains are at figuring things out, and the potential of everyone's mental capacity to learn and to develop. So I think an opposite of creativity would be more just not trying.
So it's what's that word? I'm blanking right now. The word where you just don't care.
Apathy?
Apathy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you can be in an environment when you're told not to be creative. Sometimes that means you stay totally uncreative, and sometimes it almost you get so bound up by that frustration that you almost you have this explosion of creativity and totally break away from your surroundings, and you go from growing up in Methodist church family that doesn't accept all these things to being almost totally opposite of that. You push against your surroundings. But I also think that, it's pretty rare. I don't think I've ever met a child that's not creative in whichever environment that they're in. So I think everyone also has that creativity within them, or desire to express themselves, play with things. And then some people have stimulation to keep going. Other people maybe grow out of it or are made to grow out of it. But I guess it comes back down to the potential in every person, which it really interests me.
That potential, do you think it's... Because I definitely find it striking when you brought up just the different types of environments. And because there's the external environment that people grow up in. And the fact of the matter is, in this world at least, some people don't have the luxury of being apathetic. They are in a situation where there is very much real, whether it's external, whether it's internal, whether it's immediate social circle, or just the circumstances of the infrastructure, city or neighborhood around them, where they are literally chained at the feet and behind their arms, some in the literal sense, right, behind bars, and prevented from stretching this creativity, imagination, and but some people there's no obstruction, right, and they still exercise apathy.
Absolutely, and yes, that has to be taken into account, because you're basically, I guess you could say you're squandering opportunity, but you could also say that there's no like script by which to live your life, and everyone can kind of live it the same. I know that I feel like coming from a position of like just coming from growing up in London, being well educated, having a supportive family, I feel like that
so supportive
family,
okay.
and all those things, just it's such an opportunity. It's like how I see it, to you know, be a positive influence and use a good position to try and do good things. So I definitely think where you're coming from, if you're coming from a position where you don't have the luxury of ability, you know, sometimes you don't get a chance to think, what are my opportunities here? You're dealing with very much just a day-to-day. Other times you have a lot of choice, a lot of freedom, and I think with that is an opportunity to do cool things.
Right. So in terms of, did you ever feel like you're in a moment where it was almost a juncture of creativity and innovation, where Tom Rendell, champion of creativity and just expanding that mind and exploring and always being curious, right, was about to go forth, and then suddenly that little person and voice in the back of your head said, let's just chill out, let's just hang back, why don't we just relax today?
Yeah, maybe that's pretty regular.
Yeah.
I think that it's, in terms of just my own output, I think that I'm relatively creative to a degree, but I don't have a lot of particular creative outputs in a traditional sense that would be art or music, variety of number of ways. Yeah.
Why do you think in your mind creativity is actually connected to the arts and music and what you just mentioned?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's nice to have a tangible output. And there are ways that you can do that by, you know, whether it's putting pen to paper or making a video, or just the things where, you know, making a podcast, you have something that comes out of it that you've got, it's yours, you can share it, it's wonderful. And then they're just trying to live your life in a slightly imaginative way, the way you interact with people. That I definitely don't believe there's just, you know, 4 or 5 avenues for creativity, but I think that you can get to a position where you want to feel like you've got more output, more tangible results to that, and that's often a position where I feel like I've not been able to produce that much. I'd love to change that, but I think for me it's more just been looking at quite traditional career stuff, looking at quite traditional relationships, and then you're just thinking, how can I make this more fun? How can I make this more interesting? What fun stuff can we talk about? So that's how I tend to approach it. I've not been yeah, it's funny. It's not something. I think that everyone has potential to express themselves and be creative in what they do. It always frustrates me in work environments where you have the people who are in much as like the creative people doing those things, people who are sort of organized people doing those things, and then everyone just falls into those categories, and they get kind of further and further reinforced to the extent where a very basic task, people feel like they can't do it if it's creative and they're organizational, or vice versa. I think everyone's got it within them. Some people are really talented at some things, but I'd love to have more tangible results. Things I've written would probably be the most obvious thing. That's where I have some ability. Things I've drawn and musically got a way to go. But I think that would be something I'd like to work on in terms of just having things to share with people. But then you also slightly get into this. I don't know whether it's an English thing. it's not just an English thing, no way. But it's
Probably. No,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. Well, we can say that it is.
We always blame the English.
I think it's just there is a slight. We're not the most expressive people. We're not the most the biggest sharers.
What's that Netflix show? Like very British thing, Problems, or
Yeah. I know. Yeah, there's like a million listicles, and they're all like annoyingly accurate. Basically, it's just not big sharers of emotions. Genuinely, in close-knit relationships, yes, and culturally have made huge contributions in terms of like music and the arts, but in terms of necessarily being hugely open about your feelings with friends, if I've written something, there's like a real hesitancy to share it. It's like releasing it into the world is kind of feels very personal and private, and there's a slightly built-in kind of embarrassment in English culture as well, where we think everything's kind of awkward. Partly it's because we like to give each other a lot of abuse about like the very minor things. So when you share something actually, could be like open season. But also, it's just funny the way we form relationships. It's a little bit closed off. Once you get to know people, in England, they sort of really open up, but there is that hesitancy to share. And I think as to how that relates to having a creative output, I guess people just need to be continually reminded that at any point you can start writing, drawing, take up a sport, take up a pastime, talk about your feelings. And as you know, it can be such a beneficial thing to do, and like unlock all these things that you didn't even realize you were thinking about internally.
So, I mean, that actually just makes me curious. If your family and friends hear this afterwards, are they just gonna laugh and go, "Oh, Tom is just that guy's he's so full of shit," and they're just like, "What's he doing, sharing his feelings on a publicly distributed podcast?" Right?
Yeah, well, exactly. It's my dad's Canadian, and he moved to England, lived there for 30 years. So I definitely don't. I'm sort of like 80% English is how I feel. Probably even I've 80 to 85% always lived there, but I feel like it gives me a slight step away from being 100% English, which I quite like, because like I said, that sometimes that failure to share, failure to express, it's not something I like. It's something I love about the West Coast and being in California. I think for the most part, people actually tend to be very welcoming and encouraging when you do something, when you put something out there. It's just that people don't put that much out there. It is a fear of, it's not even a fear of failure, because there's no particular, when you write something, you're not writing it for it to be published particularly, or for it to become a hit song. You're just expressing yourself.
That's because a lot of artists that you see publicly, especially musicians or even people within the performing arts in terms of like acting, or you see them sometimes in these public interviews and they're very shy, they're very reserved. They don't look like they want to share beyond that craft, right?
Totally. And I think there's just I think it's maybe a cultural problem, the difference between making music and wanting to be a professional musician, and within that is implied wanting to be like music famous. There's such huge things. There's such huge differences there. To play an instrument because you love it, to write a song because you love it, to put it online on SoundCloud because you want your friends to hear it and people to hear it. I guess because it's implied that everyone could hear it and it kind of could go viral, could get 5 million hits. It's like you could be famous. It could be that easy. You then sort of feel like a total failure when it's got like 9 views on YouTube. But people are just, people should be just doing it because they love it. I went to Cuba once, and I loved the fact that you just have, as I encountered it, was just these sort of, it wouldn't even be, sometimes it was a town square when it was more aimed at tourists, but you would just sort of go down, what felt like a kind of semi-private garden, no one around, and there'd just be like 6 guys playing, just jamming together, playing for absolutely no one. And then, you'd watch and sit down for a little bit, and they didn't mind, but they were just playing for each other in like a kind of in a very private way and just having a great time. And it was so cool to see like musicians playing, loving it with no audience at all and no danger of anyone recording it and putting it online. That's not what they were after. They were just doing it for pure enjoyment. So I think, getting people to do more, certainly what I'd like to do more is just write, express myself for my own enjoyment, and if people enjoy it as well, that's just completely great. But I think there's part of, there's like a really cathartic part of just expressing yourself, especially when you're not doing it for your job, you're doing it just for yourself.
It's actually making me think now, the more you're talking about how that act of creation and that exercise of some imagination, of some art, whether it is what people traditionally have this paradigm of, it's just like, oh, pen to paper or some sort of music. It's like, no, it can be the art of cooking, the art of maybe even just like dancing, but like a very private way. It can be the art of even meditation. That's like, that can be the art. For myself, I'm a martial artist, right? It's actually making me think, is that exercise of imagination, a creativity, is it actually a physiological and biological necessity to exercise? Because if you don't exercise that, you're actually becoming depleted or unhealthier, or it's actually harming your actual like body in some way. Because like, how like people, it actually, you aren't able to produce enough endorphins. Maybe you have more danger of becoming depressed. I mean, because, I'm thinking about it now. I'm just like, man, people who are kind of in a stagnant state, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of times you see situations where people do fall into like a depression.
I think you just get I think it's just you sort of get you're sort of locked up, and only certain parts of your brain and your personality are being used, and often it's just like the work and home divide. You use your brain at work, you switch it off at home. Obviously it's like a very old-fashioned kind of, or like traditional view of it, and kind of a dumb view. But I think any kind of expression, whether cooking, exercise, playing music, it's just using different parts of your brain. It's stimulating. It's like very stimulating, and you've got the capacity to improve at those things, and there's so much satisfaction there. And when it's like when you're a kid and you're just learning just insane amounts of things, and you could learn, if people really, you could learn 4 languages, but before the age of 3, you can like pick up a bunch of instruments, you can play all these sports, you're just learning, and it's amazing. And then I think it's so easy for us to fall into the trap of not doing that now that we're older, and we can't pick things up like exactly as quickly, but it's still totally possible. And again, I think it's the idea of possibility that I do come back to, in terms of just like thinking about people and all the opportunities we have. I know I'm as guilty as anyone of just not, there's so many times where you waste time on your phone, or you just like binge watch a series on Netflix, and it's, that you're not getting out of it except just, well, you're getting some downtime and you're enjoying it, and that's like awesome as well. But it's the possibility of what we could do. And I think what we have, unless I'm like completely wrong about this, I could learn the piano, I could become really good. I could take up martial arts, I could become really good. Like I could do all of those things. It's interesting that I don't, but I really could. And I got a little reflection of it in terms of some work I used to do in schools. It interested me. It was about how young people like form opinions, and how they kind of come to think of themselves and develop self-confidence and carve out their place in the world. In the UK, you have state schools, which are like publicly funded schools, private schools paid for by parents, and the outcomes of lives for the people who attend private schools. Generally, they tend to go into higher paid jobs and more established universities and top, a pattern that's seen the world over. The thing that I saw the most, and the only difference between those two schools, is just how much more confident students at private schools were than at state schools, because they were constantly being asked what their opinions were about things. What's your opinion on the government? What do you think about Egypt? Often their parents would have benefited from the fact that their parents subscribed to The Economist and took them on holiday to far-flung places and kind of just put all this fuel into the fire of their minds, and they just were like, oh yeah, I know Egypt, I know Thailand, like I know how government works, like, and then they can think the next step is I can be part of government, I could be the prime minister, I can be these things because the world is like, it's designed for me to be part of, right? I've been given lots of opportunities to think about where I fit into the world. Obviously that happens to some degree at state school, but the main difference in state school I saw were young people who didn't feel like the world they were going into, it was designed for them to be part of. It's like, here's how things work.
Here's a textbook.
Yeah, like I haven't been asked, you've shown me what the world is, but I've never been asked what I think about it. I've never been taken to these places. It's hard for me to see my route to like being a very highly paid banker, or being prime minister, or being an opera singer or something. So I think the fact that in that example, it's the young people who, a classic example is the boarding school of Eton, which is very famous in the UK for having produced something like 12 of our...
The boarding school...
It's called Eton, and it's like it's probably the most expensive, most prestigious, or like, upper class boarding school where the children are sent off to stay in the school. It's famous for having produced, like, I think it's about 12 of our prime ministers.
Is it a K through 12 school? Or?
Yeah, so you could go from as young as like 6 to 18, but mostly it would be like 11 to 18.
Okay.
And it costs a ton of money, and it's got every facility in the world. And I know you have a bunch of similar examples in the US. But what's interesting is, I think it's in the UK's history, I think it's produced, it might be the number is 12 UK prime ministers. That's insane. Like, that's such a high number considering we're a country of 60 million people. 12 of our top people have come from that school. But what's interesting is, if you're a student there and you look at the honours list on the school wall, you see that a bunch of your former alma mater or whatever have become prime ministers of the United Kingdom. Maybe some people even like, therefore you think you can do it. You think it's not unattainable. People who have done it, or people from your school have done it. So then, as a result of kind of thinking that you can do it, it ends up, it's a cycle that repeats itself. The UK gets more and more prime ministers from this top boarding school because people have grown up thinking that they can do it, it's possible. Versus maybe in a much poorer school, you've got people who maybe no one's ever gone from that school to university, which obviously there are schools where that is the case. And so even going to university seems totally unattainable. And as a result, people don't aspire to go to university in the same way that they would if lots of their former students, etc., had done so. So like the kind of two people, same abilities, one's being told, if you got, when you grew up, you could be prime minister. The other's being told, no one from this school has ever gone to university. And the results play out that the person who was told all the things they could be part of ends up holding a much, ends up going to achieve a lot grander things. I think simply because they just expected to. But I think also this is potentially a difference in the UK and the US, because we don't really have a version of the American dream where anyone can go on to do anything. Obviously you have like rags to riches stories, and people like Alan Sugar, who's was our English version of Donald Trump on The Apprentice, and he would say, "You're fired." Luckily, we haven't elected him, but he was sort of like selling things out the back of a car, and now he's a billionaire, and he's sort of got that rags to riches story. But it's different in that we don't have this American dream. Anyone can make it from anywhere, and once you've made it, it's more institutional, and it's more, society is slightly more, it feels more laden in sort of history and class, and where you're from dictates where you're going.
Like the school, like that.
Precisely. It's a classic example that, the school, the family you're born into, the school you go to, the university you end up in, the first job you ended up in, etc. Because of the quality of education you get, but also just through the networks that you make in those schools, people appointing friends of the family, etc. So I don't know if it's I find it interesting. I think just the idea of like social class in the UK is much stronger than it is in the US, and that's a bad thing, not a good thing. But it's just something I've noticed. But I like the idea that, I don't know. I love the idea of taking those two kids in two different schools, who go on to do different things and have all this different amounts of money invested in them, and just put them in the same class with the same situation. And I'm sure that gulf, that perceived gulf in their abilities, would disappear.
It's just the power of imagination, and just the ability for especially a young person to be able to see a real version of their imagination. Mm-hmm. It's just like when it's like when a little kid freaks out because when they go to Disneyland, because they've always had this imagination of some sort of character, and then they suddenly see their character in real life, and my nephew freaked out when he met Mickey Mouse, because Mickey Mouse was this thing he saw on TV, and then he met him in person, and he just flipped his shit, It's making me think, actually, what you just mentioned about kind of the social structure of England, how and then you made the comments like, you know what, it doesn't exist as much in the US, and it actually made me think, you know what, although it might not look in the traditional sense of like the class, you had this long history of what's the system of like where you're part of these like this court and the lords and what's that called, or like families and
it's a combination of things from it all basically it kind of all stems from still having a royal family, and then just imagining that like, yes, you've got one very obvious sort of head of the country in terms of royal family, or there, it's symbolic rather than holding genuine power. But the fact that you still have that head of state as a monarch, which is just basically like one super rich family, I think it's not then difficult to imagine the money and the influence that a bunch of other super rich families has in the country. Okay. So people say like, well, if you could remove the royal family, if you want to, a lot of people would like to, from the UK, at least they're kind of visible. You would still have a bunch of people, whether it's like wealthy families that own some of the newspapers or banks or various other things. There's just like a ton of landowning families.
I was going to say that's exact, because I was like, maybe the royal structure doesn't exist in the US, but I think different structures of power and of influence and of this, now it's like this, if you're in this situation, you're good to go. Like, if you're in this family or you're connected with this family, you're good to go. Yeah. Right?
Well, I think it feels much more, it like feels slightly more visceral in America to me.
What do you mean by that?
Certainly with race, and just like how recent everything, in such a short period of time, so much has changed, but also kind of so much hasn't changed. And I sort of feel like in the UK, whereas what you have is class, you have more of the race sort of takes that place in the US. I feel like obviously there are obviously like social classes, and there are people wielding influence in politics and finance and everything else. But I feel like it's something that sometimes people are the least comfortable with. Is, you know, there's a reason for that. It's like they're the least comfortable with something because, like, I think in the UK it's funny, people, even small differences in like class, which just, it shouldn't be an issue. It really shouldn't be an issue in like a wealthy country where there is poverty and there is extreme wealth, but for the most part everyone is extremely fortunate to have the lives they do. It can still really wind people up if someone is perceived to have insulted, like someone speaks a certain way and someone judges them for that. Someone acts differently to someone based on class. Someone is drinking like champagne, like all these cultural they're like cultural kind of like touch points that will get people wound up. And I think it's because they know there's an issue deep down. They don't quite know why. And I probably feel in the US that race takes that place more than class. But also I think that just makes sense given like the history of the country and everything that's going on. Yeah, and I have no idea how to address either one, but that's just something that I feel slightly different having moved over to the US. Yeah,
it's interesting, and we can't forget. I actually just had this conversation. The episode hasn't been released yet, so it's going to be probably released in this month, a little bit later. But we forget how short U.S. history is.
Oh my God!
It's not even, it's barely even a teenager in the scheme of like the history of the world.
It's completely it just needs to be like thought about at all times, just how completely insane it is and how short the history is. And like the insane narrative arcs of people and races and political parties and movements just overlaying each other and going crazy and blowing up and then collapsing, and how people. There is this insane podcast, Dissect, which is this music journalist. Do
you remember the name of the host? Or
I don't know. I can't remember the name of the host, but it's just done his first season, released the second season, called Dissect. He analyzes in great detail "To Pimp a Butterfly" by Kendrick Lamar, that like awesome album.
Oh, that album! Oh my God!
So like, if you already love it, listening to this and listening to the in-depth analysis of how he what Kendrick was trying to say, or what he thinks Kendrick was trying to say in that album, my respect went from incredibly high place for Kendrick Lamar to like off the charts. Just how he explores like the African American experience, both through like the historical context of like Compton and how that like kind of white rural like satellite town on the edge of LA became this like African American community that had all these really bad influences from police and like crack cocaine and all this stuff, and then looks at what it is actually means to be like a young African American man in Compton, and then you get put on this huge pedestal of fame, and how like the day-to-day pressures that you have in terms of like potentially gun violence and drugs maybe disappear a bit, but you just get hit by a whole tidal wave of other problems that society throws at you, of being like a young black man that's rich and successful, and you've got people trying to misadvise you and take and kind of bankrupt you and blame you for causing more violence through your music, and he explores this kind of problem of, and then he's sort of exploring black on black crime through that lens of just like, look what's happened to our community, and we're fighting, often we're fighting each other, and that's so crazy. But in the course of the album, he comes to like understand, to kind of have confidence in himself and his position and the African American community, and you just got to listen to it. It's so good. But that summary does an amazing job. That just reminded me recently how short the history is and how much of a roller coaster ride and I can't even begin to relate to the anger that like so justifiably should be felt in those communities.
People forget. They talk like the 60s was some prehistoric. I was like, no.
Yeah.
That, the 60s and institutional slavery did not end that long ago. People don't. It's like, about 200 or less than 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's like there are still some people who are alive whose parents
completely
were,
like it was, and it was like 20 years ago that the Spice Girls came out. Like 20 years ago, 20 years ago, that feels basically like, 5 years ago or whatever to me. And that was 20 years ago. And then you just have to, it's just like 4 times that. And you look at what was going on in like the 20s and in the 60s, and it's just completely insane. And again, I think like to my original kind of point about what fascinates me about humans is our ability to create narrative structures and sometimes to fucking lie to ourselves. It's a consensual lie. We choose to create a narrative for the African American community or for British colonialism or for
Bay Area success,
Silicon housing
Valley
prices, like the benefit of technology in our life. It's all just trends that we create, partly because there's financial incentive to do so, partly because we're not necessarily always given the right information to form our own opinions on it, or we don't seek out that information. But those narratives are so powerful, and sometimes you need to step back and sort of take a bigger picture view on it or something and think, actually, it's amazing. Sometimes, it's amazing that people are cool with some of the stuff that's gone on and are still willing to participate in society in a way that's like accepting of it. And they're not just like, you know what, fuck this.
Yeah.
Like 40 years ago, this was happening. 20 years ago, this is happening. Today, this is still happening. It's just maybe kind of packaged up in another way. But those, I think those narratives and those, they're just so powerful. And we all kind of imagine them together and are told to imagine them sometimes. And no one, and I kind of, I guess the reason why it's interesting, and I get if other animals or other things on the planet aren't doing it, like without them, would it just be complete chaos? Like, would it if we were kind of taking everything at total face value and not telling each other these stories of justification and why things are the way they are? If we didn't have those, would it just be chaos? Because everyone would be kind of going, no, like this isn't fair, that's not right, you did this. Or would it be better? I kind of don't know. But I think that
statement you just make, the ability to say, how can we make this better? That, I don't know, that actually is that uniquely human? Is that statement, is that what's been able to keep us from killing each other?
By a desire to continue to make things better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't know, because, in partly it hasn't stopped us. Like, partially, it's kind of stopped us within our own communities. Often it's just like, we're this community, we're the good guys, we have this belief system, we're doing this for these reasons. If it's at the detriment of those people, that's okay, because they're not with us. I think it's so interesting, something I remember at university about the idea of like the social construction of race, and as races being different, which has become like so obviously it's complete nonsense, but it's become something that wields such power now, and was really reinforced by the kind of like totally ridiculous science of the time of colonialism, kind of social Darwinism, environmental determinism, the idea that where you're from dictates who you are, both biologically and also a bunch of, mentally, spiritually, you are of where you were from, like you're a plant or something. It's just it's been totally ridiculed now by any kind of modern science of the last 50 years, but it did exist very strongly at the time. But an example just to show why these notions, these ideas are so ridiculous, can be seen by looking at European settlers. I think it was mostly British explorers going over to Canada, before it was ever called Canada, and interacting with native people from Canada, and I guess originally taking furs from Canada, bringing them back to Europe and bringing them back to UK to sell them. And they formed strong communities, originally formed communities with the indigenous people that were there. They formed relationships, they traveled together, they relied on the native people for information and survival. They settled down and made families together. And as the country became slightly more settled, and it was basically seen at the time that these indigenous people of Canada, they're not the same as us, but they will become the same as us. We can learn to live together. We will be together. They're just, in a very rudimentary way, they're just not quite there yet. They're a less developed version of us, which is dumb, but that was the view. Then, as Canada became more settled and they sort of moved deeper into the country, they sent for this is a very this is a very simple version of the story, but they're sending for British women came over and people who weren't the sort of frontier men, and they started to form societies. And it was at this point when they no longer kind of needed and relied on the indigenous people to survive. They'd settled down and started forming towns and stuff. They basically did a complete 180-degree turn on how they viewed the relationship between the European settlers and the indigenous people. And they said, you know what? They can never become the same as us. They're just fundamentally different, to such an extent that we need to actually separate our societies. We need to put these indigenous people on reserves. We cannot have interracial relationships. That's illegal. Any kind of miscegenation, like mixing of the blood, is illegal. We are different. They are them. We are us. Now, that's totally different from how they originally thought, and has actually gone on to sort of inform how a lot of the indigenous relationships around the world with the settlers have happened. They're separated, right? It's ridiculous. Except today there exists a group of people in Canada called the Métis tribe, the Métis people, who are the bloodline of the original European settlers, having children with the indigenous Canadians. And so they are mixed race between indigenous Canadians and white Europeans, and they exist in society. They're just everyday people, but they're totally marginalized because people can't get their head around this almost memory of a time where the two races were having children together. But the fact that was happening before we just decided, with all this bogus science and justification of what we were doing colonially, and changed our minds about race, in inverted commas, it shows there's another school of thought. Those people exist because it's not habitual that native indigenous Canadians and European settlers can't live together. Of course they can. We created that narrative to justify the fact that we wanted to kind of take over and do things our way, and they were just an inconvenience, and so we separated them rather than trying to live together. To me, the basic, just showing that's an idea that's the idea of race and races being different often, is just a very well-formed social construction, particularly backed up by science that is now proven to be completely ridiculous, is so interesting, because think about how much power that categorization and the idea of race wields today. And I just don't think anyone, when I heard that story, which my lecturer said, told way better than I just did, I was just fuck, that is a perfect example. You can show, there's a perfect way of showing that we didn't always think about race in the same way. And actually, it's nonsensical to think that indigenous people and European people can't live together. They used to. It was great. Then we decided to change our minds and we backed it up to suit our own needs. But unfortunately, it's very hard to kind of reverse that. It's very hard to reverse that school of thought.
I think this is a great place to kind of end our conversation and let the listeners continue to meditate on what was, because it's really it came down to imagination and creativity are this amazing thing that we need to encourage more of, and that also there's a responsibility to it, because imagination can lead to having this constructs like that, thinking these people aren't us, they're not the same like level, right? I know you have to get somewhere, so
yes, sadly.
So yeah, I wanted to end our conversation. It's the exact same question I end with everybody, and that is, ultimately, what's the point of all of this?
It's a very good question as well. I think genuinely just have as much fun as possible and ultimately like be good. Maybe not be good. Maybe be good is like too straight. Maybe just like I think don't be bad. I think there's no merits, however successful you get, however much you achieve, if the output of what you're doing is a negative one, whether, you know, however far down the line that could be, whether it's like the industrial waste that your company makes, or what people put into their bodies, or just how you go around influencing other people. You know, it's like classic kind of John Steinbeck school of thought. It's like, if, you know, the richest guy who dies, and no one goes to his funeral, and the guy who dies with nothing and everyone's there, you know, it's just like, I think that says it all to me. But as well as just like enjoying yourself along the way as much as possible.
Okay, gang, that's this episode with Tom. Thanks for your support. As always, this episode is available for download on my site, on iTunes, on Google Play, on TuneIn Radio, on Stitcher. Please subscribe on any of those channels or wherever you're listening to this, and I'll keep you posted with new episodes. Lastly, remember to send me ideas or subscribe to my mailing list on www.talkhuman2.me. Okay, hugs, fist bumps, bye now.